Assalamu alaikum, YouTube. Welcome to another session by Al-Mawrid, Canada. We are here today with four panelists, three of whom are here, and we have lost Mukarram. Never mind. So we are here today after a hiatus of over 2 months with a session on philosophy by our brother from Turkey, British-born philosopher Jamie B. Turner, who is a doctoral researcher at the Center for Philosophy of Religion at the University of Birmingham in the UK. His primary research area is in analytic Islamic philosophy of religion, with a particular focus on religious epistemology and natural theology. He's going to present a talk, inshallah, for about 30 or 40 minutes on the topic of Islamic religious epistemology. It's a talk that we've been wanting to have for the last many months, but because of Ramadan and other engagements, we've not been able to do that. Jamie is, mashallah, very well published for a young philosopher and very hot on the Islamic talk circuit recently. And we're very glad to have him here. We're going to wait for another panelist of ours to come back in, Mukarram Wahid. Oh, yes, Mukarram is here again. So let me introduce the other panelists. Mushfiq Sultan is an assistant fellow and researcher with Al-Mawrid Institute. He's been a long-time student of Javed Ahmed Ghamidi Sahib and has written a book, mashallah, published in 2014, was it not, or 2015, on Isaiah 42. He's also been particularly active on the blogosphere and the vlogosphere. We also have with us Mukarram Wahid, who's a young researcher, recently completed his MPhil from the University of Delhi in history, and he's interested in Sufism as a practitioner and a researcher. My name is Danish Hamid. Some of the viewers of this channel may have noticed my presence or may not have noticed my presence, depending on my performance in the last few sessions as panelist. I'm a philosophy PhD, and that's basically the most interesting thing about me. We are going to begin this session right away. Over to you, Jamie, and you may begin your presentation whenever you feel ready. Thank you.
Yeah, assalamu alaikum, everybody. It's lovely to be with you. It's an honor and pleasure to be here, and thanks for that kind introduction, Danish. So yeah, as you can see, the presentation here is entitled Islamic Religious Epistemology. So this presentation is based on a forthcoming book chapter that I have co-authored with another philosopher called Enis Doko, which will be out sometime this year, inshallah, in the Cambridge Handbook of Religious Epistemology. So the presentation is essentially a synopsis and overview of that chapter. So as is evident from the title, the talk and the chapter is about religious epistemology from within an Islamic vantage point or from an Islamic perspective. Religious epistemology in general is a subdiscipline within philosophy of religion or epistemology. And it's concerned with such questions as how can we know God's existence? Is that possible? What sort of evidence might be needed to know God's existence? Is there any evidence available for God's existence? How could we be rational or justified in upholding theism, or specifically Islamic theism? Could testimony be a source of knowledge? Could we be justified or rational in believing our religious beliefs on the basis of testimony? So essentially questions that are epistemic in nature and that have a religious import. Islamic religious epistemology is obviously a way of addressing those questions from specifically within the Islamic tradition. So that's the general theme of the presentation here. And the subheading is a contemporary philosophical overview. So the chapter in this presentation is an overview in the sense that it's not a super in-depth analysis of all of the different positions within the Islamic tradition on religious epistemology, but it's a kind of general overview of the positions within the theological tradition. And it's called a contemporary philosophical overview because the general methodological approach that this chapter has tried to take is one of essentially translating broadly medieval positions a contemporary philosophical idiom or language. So that's generally the methodological approach I take in dealing with Islamic philosophy of religion in general. I think it's important to basically stay true and honest and fair to the broadly medieval positions, but we have to try and kind of translate those positions over into contemporary philosophy by using the concepts and conceptual framework available, whilst, as I said, trying to stay true to the original positions, although allowing a kind of broad scope. So the overview of the chapter in the presentation is as follows. It's a look at the positions of religious epistemology within the Muslim theological tradition. Now, the Muslim theological tradition is not the only tradition within Islam. For instance, it's not the, say, Falsafi tradition, for instance. We're not looking at Ibn Sina and Ibn Rushd and Al-Farabi, etc. here. It's not the kind of mystic approach of the Sufis or the broadly Tasawwuf tradition. All of these are very interesting traditions or aspects of the Islamic tradition which deserve close attention, but it's not the focus of the chapter or this presentation. So I want to take a look at that in a bit more detail. What do I mean by the Muslim theological tradition? And then go through religious epistemology again in general, look at the basic positions within the theological tradition, and then sort of wrap up and conclude. So within the Muslim theological tradition, myself and my co-author, we basically refer to two segments or aspects of the Muslim theological tradition, one of which we call Islamic Rationalism, and the other one we call Islamic Traditionalism. Now, from the get-go, one should not understand Islamic Traditionalism as referring to an anti-rationalist view, but Islamic Rationalism is best understood, I think, as that segment of the tradition within the context of religious epistemology, which lays the greatest emphasis on reason. So, for instance, the Mu'tazili, Ash'ari, and Maturidi schools of theology, the basic Kalam schools, usually lay great emphasis on reason within the context of religious epistemology, because they might think that in order for one's religious belief to be justified or classed as knowledge for a person, that individual must have a kind of rational argument accessible to them in some sense. Either they present it or that they're familiar with that evidence by way of rational argument. By contrast, Islamic traditionalism is that aspect or segment of the tradition which, as I said, is not necessarily irrationalist. In fact, the Islamic traditionalists, quote unquote, will often refer to aql or reason, and they'll even engage in offering rational arguments, and they will suggest that their position is supported by reason, but they arguably place a greater epistemic weight on scripture and or aspects that lie beyond reason. For example, fitra, or a kind of spiritual heart or disposition, i.e. the qalb. And within Islamic rationalism, as I said, we have basically the broadly schools of ilm al-kalam, but within Islamic traditionalism, here I'm talking about some of the kind of figures that come out of the Hanbali school, such as Ibn Qudama and Ibn Taymiyyah. So I'm going to be looking at these two trends and looking at it from a perspective of the Kalam schools within Islamic rationalism and the kind of Hanbali Athari positions adopted by people like Ibn Qudama, Ibn Taymiyyah concerning Islamic traditionalism. Now, as I said, I want to try and translate the ideas from these medieval thinkers and schools into the conceptual language of contemporary philosophy. So within religious epistemology and contemporary philosophy of religion, we have three basic positions. One is sometimes referred to as evidentialism or theistic evidentialism, And this position basically says that theistic belief is justified for somebody if and only if it's based on good evidence. Now, there's a debate over what constitutes good evidence. Could that be intuitions? Could that be religious experiences? Could that be arguments? For instance, like the cosmological or teleological arguments. Typically, theistic evidentialists will think that some kind of argument, like a philosophical argument, a cosmological argument, for instance, or a design argument, those are the kind of evidences that are necessary for one's theistic belief to be justified. Of course, there's also a question here about the difference between justification and knowledge. There's a difference between those two things. You could be justified in believing in something without necessarily knowing, but we might say that theistic evidentialists with respect to justification say that in order for one to be justified in believing in God, one needs to base their belief on good evidence. In order for one to know, one also needs to base it on good evidence. A radically different position at times within the literature is a position called fideism. Fideism is the idea that theistic belief is justified, at least in part, on supra-rational grounds, or grounds which go beyond reason or rationality in some sense. For example, faith or a spiritual disposition. Now, there are a spectrum of fideists, so it's very, very hard to kind of define fideism. At times, within the literature, we see like strong fideists, who basically think that, even if rational argument and evidence contradicts one's religious belief, one can still wholeheartedly uphold it. Or they might think that one can hold their religious beliefs without engaging in any kind of rational inquiry at all. But there are other fideists who say, well, look, actually, religious belief is in some sense based on reason, but we need the right kind of spiritual disposition, maybe trust in God, or a kind of the right, say, spiritual character to be able to assess the evidence for God. If we don't have that spiritual character, we just won't pick up on the evidence for God. So that's fideism. And the Reformed epistemology is simply the position that theistic belief can be justified for someone, even in the absence of argument, without arguments at all. So, for instance, perhaps one has a very rich religious experience, which of course is not an argument. One is overwhelmed maybe when they reflect on the beauty of nature, when they're looking up at the starry night sky, or they're reflecting on the elegant beauty of a daffodil basking in the sun. Maybe in these conditions and circumstances, people are overwhelmed by a sense of the divine presence, and maybe that is sufficient for somebody to be justified, and maybe even in certain contexts know the divine. So those are the three positions that I want to basically align the approaches within Islamic religious epistemology to. So kind of using this threefold typology as a way to kind of investigate the positions within the Muslim theological tradition. And finally, we find contemporary thinkers within each of these three positions, either theistic evidentialists, fideists, and Reformed epistemologists. John Bishop, in his book Believing by Faith, defends a fideistic view, a William Jamesian view, where even if your evidence for theism or Islamic theism or Christian theism is not clear or is ambiguous, you could still be justified in a practical or a moral sense in adopting that worldview. Richard Swinburne, the most famous of these three philosophers, arguably, although Alvin Plantinga maybe is equally as famous, but certainly his book, The Existence of God, is probably more famous than the other two, is a book which is really rooted in the theistic evidentialist tradition and tries to offer a Bayesian probabilistic case for the idea that the hypothesis of theism is more probable than the hypothesis that not theism. Alvin Plantinga's book, Warranted Christian Belief, defends the idea that theistic belief, and specifically even Christian belief, can be a piece of knowledge for somebody, even if they don't have any arguments. So within the context of Islamic rationalism, this is basically the framework and the things that we outline in the chapter that I think are important to consider. So as I said, I'm thinking here in terms of the basic view of the mutakallimun, of those engaged in kalam. Now, whether you were a Mu'tazili, an Ash'ari, or a Maturidi, obviously there's some differences within these different schools, but there's a general congruence when it comes to matters of epistemology and religious epistemology. There's a general agreement. So, for instance, the Mutakallimun recognize non-inferential knowledge, and they recognize inferential knowledge, or what they term ilm daruri and ilm muktasab. So the general epistemological framework is to separate what we can know in a kind of non-inferential and immediate way, and what we can know on the basis of argument or evidence. These two broad distinctions are really important because they're going to say that beliefs such as the existence of God and Islam are not things that fall into the category of ilm daruri, but they fall into the category of ilm muktasab. And if they do, then that's going to mean that an argument is necessary in some sense, or evidence beyond our mere kind of immediate apprehension of things. They also recognize together collectively three sources of knowledge: sense perception, hiss, and they divide that into al-hiss al-batin and al-hiss al-zahir. So you have our perception, which is like external perception of things outside in the world, things around me. There's also things in my room, in the rooms that you're all in, that I'm sure you can perceive and have knowledge of. Al-hiss al-batin refers to introspection, the things that we can know about ourselves, about what we're thinking, about what we're feeling. They also recognize aql, or reason, as a source of knowledge, of course. And aql can give us things in an immediate way, in a non-inferential way, in a daruri type way. For instance, they recognize things which they refer to as al-badihiyat, or self-evident logical truths, like the law of non-contradiction, that A cannot be B and not B at the same time, or that 1 + 1 = 2. But they also think reason can be used to make inferences as well. That you can, for instance, observe the world and you can observe various particulars, and you can abstract from those particulars a kind of a universal, or that you can infer from pieces of evidence that the existence of something. For instance, if one perceives if one perceives smoke, then one can infer from that there's probably fire nearby, and that would be a case of inference in the context of reason. And they also believe testimony is a source of knowledge, or al-khabar. Khabar can be mutawatir, it can be multiple or mass in transmission, or it could be ahad, it could be singular. And of course, they give more epistemic weight to things which are mutawatir than ahad. But those are the sources of knowledge that they agree on. Now, what about religious epistemology? That's a general epistemological approach of the Mutakallimun. What about religious epistemology? How can we know whether God exists or not? And how can we know whether Islam is true or not? Well, there are three basic intuitions that the Mutakallimun seem to have in regards to answering this question. And they are as follows. Number one, they reject taqlid, or blind following or imitation, in matters of theistic belief. I could have worded this a bit differently, because they think it's an unreliable source of knowledge. For instance, Qadi Abdul Jabbar, famous Mu'tazili, or Al-Maturidi, in his Kitab al-Tawheed. If you open up the first chapter in Kitab al-Tawheed, I think he mentioned something along the lines that all of these different religious traditions, competing traditions, are all claiming to be true and claiming to be from God. And so if we just use taqlid as our way of coming to know, then it's just a matter of luck whether we've ended up in the right tradition or not. We don't really know. We're just blindly following. So taqlid is not appropriate because it's unreliable. If we want to know anything about the world, we need to base our belief on grounds which prevent luck or preclude luck. If you happen to get a true belief by a matter of luck, you don't know it. You just accidentally happened upon it. That's the first thing. Of course, the contrary of taqlid would be something like ijtihad or independent reasoning and searching. So that's an intuition which leads to view. The other thing is that the mutakallimun don't think that theistic belief is a default belief in the same way that, say, I can see my laptop is here. I can see I have a cup on my table, that there's a curtain here, that there is a pencil and a book and so on. I believe these things in an immediate way, and I can't help believing them. And so these can be cases of ilm daruri. I can know these things non-inferentially. But they would say we don't have a faculty to know God in that kind of way, in the way that we know all these other things around us, in a basic way. So if theistic belief is not a belief like believing what's in front of me, or self-evident logical truths like 1 + 1 = 2, or believing what I did yesterday on the basis of my memory, then that seems to suggest there's some other way that we need to get that knowledge, because we can't rely on these sort of immediate apprehensions. And the third intuition, which is a culmination of the two, is something called wujub al-nadhar. Wujub al-nadhar is the idea that we have a duty to engage in inference and reasoning. The reason why we have a duty to engage in reasoning and inference to the existence of God and the truth of Islam is because of A and B. Because A, taqlid is unreliable, and B, we can't know God in this immediate way because we don't have a kind of faculty to give us that knowledge immediately. We have to infer God's existence from things in the world. For instance, if we look around us, we see that the world seems to be well designed and orderly and put together, so we can infer that there must be a designer who put it together. Or in the traditional kalam way, we can infer from the fact that the universe had a beginning that it must have had a cause, and that cause must be God. So that's generally the approach. I think this quote from Nicholas here, from his 1993 article on the priority of reason and revelation, or something along those lines, is a good summary of this position on the basis of the three intuitions I've just mentioned. And he says that knowledge of all these matters, meaning the matters of God and Islam, can be gained only through reasoning, nadhar. This is because such knowledge is not necessary, daruri, or non-inferential, but is, on the contrary, acquired knowledge, muktasab. Nor can it be gained through illumination, ilham, or through purification of the inner self, tasfiyat al-batin, or by instruction, ta'lim, of an infallible imam. So this is the kalam view, that knowledge of God has to be inferred from data from the world, because we don't have like this faculty that gives us immediate knowledge of God, like our sensory faculties or our memory or something. And belief in God is not like a logically self-evident belief, like 1 + 1 = 2. So it must be acquired knowledge. They also reject illumination or ilham because Al-Mawrid, for example, mentions that, again, every religious tradition has members who claim to have experiences of God. So how can we determine which one of those is veridical or not? We need an argument to basically determine which is veridical. And likewise for tasfiyat al-batin, again, it's sort of similar to ilham in that sense. And they also reject the kind of Ismaili approach. So what to say then? It seems the result is that the Kalam view, the Islamic rationalist view, is one of theistic evidentialism. However, there are a broad spectrum of views, and it seems that you could say that even if the Islamic rationalists are theistic evidentialists, they could be theistic evidentialists in different ways. So we have strong, moderate, and sensible theistic evidentialism. Now, by the latter one, sensible, I don't mean that this is more reasonable than the others. It's just in the literature called sensible evidentialism. So it's not my term, but strong theistic evidentialism is the view that for one's theistic belief to be positively epistemically appraised, by that I mean appraised with rationality, justification, or knowledge, it must be based on rational argument or proof. So examples that we give in the chapter are like Qadi Abdul Jabbar, Al-Mawrid, Al-Juwayni, and others. Al-Mawrid, for instance, to refer to him again, refers to this notion of a hujjatul aqliya, or a rational proof that's needed. Qadi Abdul Jabbar, a kind of dalil, and Al-Juwayni as well. Al-Juwayni seems to suggest that you need to know the Kalam proofs, and you even need to know the objections to the Kalam proofs and the counter-objections to the Kalam proof before you can really know. So that would be a strong theistic evidentialist view, that you need to have a rational proof or argument for God's existence, and maybe Islam too, in order to know that those things are true. But a moderate theistic evidentialist would be someone who says that one's theistic belief to be positively epistemically appraised, again, to be appraised with justification or knowledge or something, may be based on something like a seeming or intuition or religious experience. So a seeming is something like, it seems to me that my laptop is in front of me. Therefore, in the absence of any counter evidence, I am justified in thinking that there really is a laptop in front of me. Now, a friend of mine who is a lecturer in theology in Sweden, called Tobias Andersson, he recently published a book that's in Swedish. So I didn't really understand much of it, but he helped me. And it's about Muhammad bin Yusuf as-Sanusi. And in that book, he suggests that as-Sanusi's position can allow for a moderate theistic evidentialism. And Sanusi basically makes a distinction between what he calls dalil tafsili and dalil jumli. And dalil tafsili is basically detailed evidence, and dalil jumli is general evidence. Now, the detailed evidence would be something like a kind of rational, intricate and detailed, sophisticated proof, but the dalil jumli would be something more general, which might be grounded in reason in the sense that it's based on tafakkur, it's based on reflecting on the world, but it's a kind of just a sense that God exists, that God made things, and so on. And maybe for certain believers, ordinary believers, a dalil jumli is all that's necessary. Although one might say it's sufficient for justification, but maybe knowledge, I'm not so sure. And finally, the sensible, sorry, Danish, yeah?
Yes. Jamie, could you say more about seemings, what seemings are? Is it something similar to what Michael Huemer calls phenomenal conservatism? The idea that if something seems to me to be the case, then it probably is the case, unless there is stronger evidence that it isn't the case. Could you say something more about that? Is it Sanusi's view? Is that Dalil Jumli?
It's exactly that, in the sense that Tobias Andersson compares as-Sanusi's view to phenomenal conservatism. He literally does that, but he does that in the context of the Dalil Jumli. So what Dalil Jumli is, general evidence, could be, Tobias Andersson argues, interpreted as a kind of seeming. Based on, say, tafakkur of nature, that when I look at the horizon, when I ponder the flowers in nature, when I look up at the starry night sky, and so on, it seems to me, on the basis of my reflection, that God exists and made this. And that might be enough for the ordinary believer. So yeah, thanks for that, Danish. And the final view, sensible evidentialism, is the view that an argument might not be required for someone individually, but it must be available in the community. So Al-Ansari, the famous Ash'ari theologian, he makes a distinction between, well, it's not his view, but he's saying that there is a view within the Ash'ari school, which basically says that there is a difference between, as we know, a fard ayn and fard kifaya, and he says that there might be a fard kifaya for the community to have arguments and to rebut objections to Islam, but it's not necessarily a fard ayn. And so for the ordinary believer, for the faith of the old lady, we might say, maybe she doesn't need to be familiar with arguments, but maybe an argument is still necessary for the epistemic health of her belief within the community. So that's another view that seems within the Islamic rationalist tradition. So yeah, that's basically the Islamic rationalist tradition. I know I'm kind of, I've gone a bit slower than I intended here, but the Islamic, Danish?
It's absolutely fine. I mean, I don't think we are tired yet, or our viewers would be tired, so you can take as much time as you like.
Okay, good.
We can have a shorter question and answer session if it becomes too much. Yeah.
No, I don't think it will. I think there are only, 3 more slides, technically 2. So the Islamic traditionalist view I'm suggesting is a different view from the Islamic rationalist view. As I said earlier, this is not to say that Islamic traditionalism is irrationalism. I certainly don't mean that. Sherman Jackson, in his book on Islam and the problem of black suffering, I think he rightly points out that Islamic traditionalists, he uses this term, by the way, I'm basically borrowing it from him. He says that the Islamic traditionalists invoked reason as much as the rationalists did, and they often engaged in rational argumentation. Even Ahmad ibn Hanbal, rahimahullah, for instance, when he was defending the view that the Quran is not makhluk, not created, but is God's eternal speech, he used rational arguments, for instance. But the Islamic traditionalists, often associated with the Hanbali view, sometimes called Hanbalis, Atharis. In this contemporary context, the Salafis might fall into this view to some extent too. But they reject what we might call the concrete reason of their day, but not normative or ideal reason. So, as we know, in the context of Islamic history, there was this great influence of Greek philosophy, which obviously had great influence on Kalam, particularly later Kalam through Ibn Sina, and obviously the philosopher in general drew on Aristotelian and Neoplatonic ideas, and the Islamic traditionalists or Muslim traditionalists basically thought that the Hellenized rationality of their day is not pure reason or pure rationality. Rather, what the Quran is coming with is pure reason and rationality. And anything that the Quran comes with is in complete congruence with it. So they thought that the arguments that raised by the Mutakallimun, which they found to be problematic from a scriptural point of view, were actually contrary to reason, in a sense. Now, there are 2 representatives that we refer to in the chapter of a traditionalist view. One of them is Ibn Qudama, and another one is Ibn Taymiyyah. Now, Ibn Qudama, he has this famous treatise, Tahrim al-Nadar, and it's basically the censure of speculative theology of Kalam. And his view can be spelled out in the following way. First of all, he rejects this idea of wujub al-nadar, this idea that every Muslim has a duty or obligation to engage in nadar, to engage in reasoning, to try to prove God's existence. For 2 reasons, at least. One, because not all Muslims can fulfill that duty. Certainly, the faith of the old lady I referred to earlier, I mean, ordinary believers are not necessarily equipped to engage in nadar in the way that the Mutakallimun understand it. And also, the Prophet ﷺ didn't teach that. It just seems quite obvious that that was not what was going on at the time of the Prophet. So he rejects that. Now that seems to suggest that taqleed is now the route in from his point of view. But he has this passage which is a little bit confusing, which we do quote. And he basically says that look, taqleed is fine when it comes to like doing taqleed of your like school of fiqh. But then he says, but doing taqleed in matters which are known by ijma' and are very clear, such as God's existence, God's nature, praying 5 times a day and stuff like that, people have an obligation to know those things for themselves. But that is not very different from taqleed, because it does seem to just presuppose the truth of Islam. He just presupposes that Islam is true. And he basically says that, look, this is known by ijma' of who? By the Muslims. And so he's already presupposing Islam is true. Now, at the same time, in saying that, then he seems to suggest that what's required rather than taqleed is ittiba'. Ittiba' in this context would mean not merely following, but having a religious evidence, a scriptural evidence to support your view, rather than a kind of independent evidence like what the Kalam folks are suggesting. But then that just seems to be a kind of presuppositionalist approach, supposing that Islam is true, rather than showing us how we can know it's to be true. So that doesn't seem to be a very helpful view. Now, it seems to me, though, if you were to quiz Ibn Qudama, if he was with us today, he would nonetheless say that Islam is rational and reasonable, and it doesn't seem that Islamic traditionalists uphold a kind of Christian fideistic view where they're saying that we are fallen creatures with fallen reason and we need revelation to lift us up before we can say anything about God. But then how do we flesh it out? Well, I think the best way to flesh Ibn Qudama's view out is in terms of what Ibn Taymiyyah comes up with. And Ibn Taymiyyah, for me, represents the intellectual heights of the Hanbali tradition. And I think to use this idea of translating, John Hoover has a good article called Theology in Translation, and Ibn Taymiyyah seems to be doing that. He seems to be translating traditionalist views into the framework of Kalam. So he's not a mutakallim per se, but he's translating it into the views of Kalam. Now, Ibn Taymiyyah, he, in his famous work, Dar Ta'arud al-Aqli wa Naql, the averting the conflict between reason and revelation, he says, look, reason and revelation are congruent, but in that sense, he's referring to aql sarih, or pure reason, and naql sahih. So he has this couple of aql sarih, naql sahih. Pure reason and authentic scripture, they cohere. But if you have naql sahih, or sound, authentic revelation, with bid'i aqli, with something that's a kind of contaminated dictate of reason, and that might conflict. But there is no conflict between reason and revelation in the purest sense. So these traditionalists, although I'm going to suggest here are fideistic in one sense, are not fideistic in another sense, in the sense they do see a congruence between reason and revelation. So how do we know God, or how can we be justified in believing in God for traditionalists? Well, Ibn Taymiyyah basically says that we can know that God is existent and know him through fitrah. So fitrah for Ibn Taymiyyah obviously is a Quranic notion, and it's found in the Quran and in the Hadith. But he fleshes it out in a way unlike most others, because he really squeezes the most out of the concept of fitrah for epistemological use. So it seems to me anyway that Ibn Taymiyyah thinks that human beings have been created on this natural constitution, this natural disposition. And part of this natural constitution is that God is endowed with natural cognitive faculties like reason, perception, memory, introspection, and so on. And as long as these natural cognitive faculties, which are grounded in our human nature, are working properly, we can know all sorts of things about what's around us, about what we did yesterday, about how we feel, and so on. But Ibn Taymiyyah, in following the Hadith and the Quran, of course, we know the Hadith that every child is born on fitrah. Ibn Taymiyyah seems to suggest that we have this natural theistic disposition of faculty, a fitri theistic disposition, which, when working well in the right environment, and so on, will be able to culminate with belief in God. And this theistic disposition is activated for Ibn Taymiyyah when we perceive God's signs in nature. Ayatul afaq, for instance, the signs in the cosmos, ayatul anfus, the signs within ourselves, and also the ayat in scripture, of course, to give us a more richer conception of God, and of course to give us a truth about Islam. We have these ayat which make up what the Quran is. But fitra can be damaged or impaired or corrupted in some sense, as we know from that hadith that every child is born on fitra, but only the parent of the Jew, the Christian, Zoroastrian changed the disposition or the beliefs of that child. So fitra can be impaired. Indeed, it seems that in order for our faculties to work properly, we do need to be in the right environment. If you, for instance, if you put me in a dark room or you blindfold me, my senses are not going to do a very good job. If you put me underwater, it's going to infect the workings of my cognitive faculties. So it seems that the environments that were in affect our cognition. It also seems to be the case that with respect to religious belief, if we were in an environment, say if we were growing up in a very oppressive communist regime, for instance, where religious belief and teaching was suppressed, it's less likely that we're going to form a conception of God or to access true beliefs about God, because that natural disposition is being suppressed by the epistemic environment. So we need to be in the right sort of environment, but fitra can also be impaired in other ways, for instance, by basically nurturing certain vices. There are different vices. Ibn Taymiyyah, for instance, refers to following our desires, or blindly following, again, he uses technically, blindly following one's society. Those could be sort of intellectual and spiritual vices. So in order to basically nurture fitra, we need the right kind of intellectual and spiritual virtues. We need to remember God, be in contact with God, be in touch with God in some sense. And as I said, be in the right sort of environment. And if we are, then we can know God exists. So it seems to me that the traditionalist view is reformed epistemological, because as I said earlier, reformed epistemology is the view that religious belief or theistic belief can be known without arguments in this kind of fitly way, let's say. But it also seems to be fideistic in a weak or responsible sense, because he's saying that there's something beyond reason that's necessary to know God. We need the right fitra, the right kind of disposition and virtues and environment. But I also think it seems to be in line with a kind of moderate theistic evidentialism too. There's a lot going on here, because maybe these experiences of God could count as evidences as well. When we reflect on the ayat of Allah, we have a sense that God is present and so on. So there's a lot going on there. So in conclusion, we think that the Islamic rationalist position is essentially theistic evidentialist, and it could be a strong or moderate or a sensible form. And Islamic traditionalists seem to kind of culminate in this mixture of moderate evidentialism, reformed epistemology, and a kind of fideistic view. So that's it in essence.
Excellent. Jazakallah khairan, Brother Jamie. I think we're going to have a question and answer session immediately, but since we are on this slide, and I think the thing that might confuse most of our listeners would be sensible evidentialism. As you yourself pointed out, this what are the other evidentialisms are nonsensible or nonsensical in some sense. That's the sense they might get. So could you say something about this, and then we could have a short break and then a question answer session.
Yeah. Sorry if I didn't make that very clear. So sensible evidentialism is a view defended firstly by a philosopher called Stephen Dijkstra. And Stephen Dijkstra wants to consider how we could find some middle ground between theistic evidentialism, which says that in order to know God, we need arguments, and Reformed epistemology that says we don't need arguments. And what Weichscher suggests is the following. Consider our belief in the existence of electrons, right? How do we know that they're electrons? For the ordinary person, we read that in a textbook, or a teacher tells us, a scientist tells us. Can I be justified in believing in electrons that way? And can I even know in that way? Yeah, sure. It's perfectly reasonable for somebody to trust the scientific textbooks. If somebody is at school learning about these things, it seems perfectly reasonable. But it's also the case that the scientist needs to have evidence. The scientist who does the research and the observations, they need to have evidence for postulating the existence of electrons. So there needs to be evidence somewhere in the community. The scientist needs to have the evidence available. And then we, as laymen, we trust the scientist. So we know without arguments, but the scientist knows on the basis of arguments. And it seems that the epistemic health of our belief, not based on arguments, is depend on arguments being out there available in the community, which the scientist has. Suppose that it turns out that all of the evidence that the scientists have are misleading, and they come to the view that, in fact, there don't exist such things called electrons. That would affect the epistemic health of us as laymen. If we just carried on believing in electrons, even though there is no evidence, even in its communal sense, then probably we wouldn't be justified, or we couldn't know. But just so long as there is evidence in the community somewhere, then for us ordinary folk, we can be rational, justified, or have knowledge of this thing. So he called it sensible evidentialism because he thought it's not sensible to suggest that ordinary people need to have arguments and inferences. And maybe religious belief is not something you can just know in the kind of basic way without there being arguments somewhere in the community. So that's his view, and he called it sensible evidentialism, and he compared it to like believing in electrons.
That in some sense would correspond to the Fard Kifaya view that you also mentioned, right?
Exactly.
Excellent. Jazakallah khairan for this very succinct explanation. What we're going to do is we're going to take a 5-minute. Okay, shall we begin?
Yes. Yeah, I'm ready, inshallah.
Okay, Bismillah, Alhamdulillah, wassalatu wassalamu ala Rasulillah. So let's continue with where we left. Brother Jamie gave a very succinct, very interesting and very thorough presentation for a 45-minute presentation. And if you want to look at more of his work, you can go to his academia page and find his articles, which you can download and read. So, Brother Jamie, let's continue this. I have a question or two for you. In your presentation, you talked about John Bishop, who has a Jamesian sort of epistemology when it comes to the question of God, theism, or etc. So in his book, Believing by Faith, and you didn't say much about it, but I have a feeling that you wish to say that in cases where there is competing evidence on both sides on a particular question, in this case, let's say the existence of God, there can be an element of fideism in that, or there can be an element of willing to believe, in James's words, where you decide on the basis of considerations which are not evidentialist, right? So is that a viable view in your opinion, and is there an analog for that in the Islamic tradition? So what do you say about that?
I think that's a good question. So yeah, I mean, John Bishop's book Believing by Faith is a defense of William James's view. William James wrote a very famous essay called The Will to Believe. And basically, James considers some situations where we might not have overwhelming evidence for a particular belief, but we're morally justified nonetheless in believing that. Some kind of Jamesian examples are one such as, suppose somehow I don't know how this would happen, but suppose you were stranded somewhere on the top of a mountain and you needed to make a leap from one part of the mountain to the other. And if you didn't make this leap, you were going to fall all the way down and you were guaranteed to die pretty much. Well, James and the Jamesian sort would say that even if you don't have good evidence for thinking you're going to make the jump, but if believing that you will make the jump will help you in some sense psychologically and affect you physiologically as a result to actually make the jump, and given that you should act in your own practical interests, or that you have a moral duty to preserve your own being or something, then you're morally justified in believing that you're going to make the jump. There are some other examples I think about somebody.
How many women have fallen in love with the man who insisted that they love him? So romantic conquest also, he gives the example of.
That's what I was just about to say. That's exactly the same thing. Yeah. So I'm glad you're familiar with these. Now, I don't personally find this view very satisfying in the sense that I'm not so much concerned with what's pragmatically or practically justified for me to believe or morally justified. I'm concerned with what I'm epistemically justified in believing. I happen to agree with William James's views, by the way, but that wouldn't give me much confidence when I'm thinking of, can I be epistemically justified in believing in God's existence? Or can I know that God exists? His approach doesn't answer that question, but nonetheless, I think that his view in the limited context that he gives it is fine. Now, I don't really see a parallel within the Islamic tradition, but I will tell you that there is a Muslim philosopher called Imran Ijaz, who is at the University of Michigan. And he wrote a book called Islam, A Contemporary Investigation, I believe, published by Routledge in 2018. I'm friends with Imran, and he co-authored a paper with John Bishop, and John Bishop was his supervisor, PhD supervisor. And Imran upholds a view like John Bishop. And Imran defends a view which Bishop coined, he uses this term, doxastic venture, that where your evidence is, say, ambiguous, or it's not necessarily overwhelming or convincing, you can take a doxastic venture. You can venture into believing in something on pragmatic grounds. So, I think that that's okay. But as I said, it doesn't answer the bearing epistemic question. Can I be epistemically justified in believing in God? If you're saying that the evidence is, say, underwhelming or not convincing, then I think epistemically, you're not in a great position there. Like in the romantic, example, or on the mountain, I'm not epistemically justified because I don't have good evidence that I'm going to make the leap, but I'm practically justified in believing it. Well, I want to know whether I'm epistemically justified in believing in God, or whether I can know God. So, yeah.
Right. Let me push you a little bit on this.
Go on.
So, could it be the case that in questions of such magnitude, such as whether moral values exist, whether there is beauty in the Sistine Chapel, whether there is a God, whether I should sacrifice for my child, these are not epistemic questions, but rather these kinds of moral or / practical questions which trump the epistemic value or valence which the person who asks the epistemic question is missing. Perhaps these are not epistemic questions at all. What do you say about that?
Well, I mean, you're asking a question, perhaps they're not epistemic questions at all. But what's the reason to think they're not epistemic questions? I don't see it. I think that it's a valid question to think, do I have good reason for thinking that there are moral values or there are moral duties? That is an appropriate question. Do I have good reason for thinking it?
So the Jamesian response for that would be that I want to retrieve or secure all the beautiful, eternal, everlasting things which only belief in God or belief in the supernatural can provide me. On the other hand, the person who's the materialist, if he chooses the materialist option or the physicalist option or the atheist or non-theist or agnostic option, he loses all those things of everlasting beauty. So it stops being an epistemic question for him.
So say that last part again, sorry.
It stops being an epistemic question for the reason that if there is evidence, let's say, even or whatever kind of evidence there might be, let's say for materialism or because of the advancement of science, the person who chooses the materialist option, he can no longer secure for his life world everything which is eternal and beautiful and everlasting, which includes morality, which includes the sublime, which includes looking at the Sistine Chapel and being transported to a different realm, all of that. Yeah.
Well, I mean, such is the perils of atheism, but that's one way to respond. I suppose that naturalists probably have a way of reconciling it to themselves without making the theistic leap. Whether I agree with that or not is a different question. I mean, it's interesting that most moral philosophers today are moral realists. They do believe in objective moral values, even though the majority of them are not theists. Yes. But again, I think that what you suggested, the scenario that you laid out, is not to suggest that it's not an epistemic question again. It wouldn't mean just because they happen to hold a naturalistic view, which implies certain things, that it's still not an epistemic question. I mean, the question as to whether I have good evidence or good grounds for believing in something, I think applies for any belief. And I don't see any good reason to think it doesn't in any context or any situation. But I have no problem in agreeing with William James in saying that I could be morally and practically rational or justified in believing in something, even if I don't have, really strong evidence for it. So I have no problem with that. I agree with Pascal in a sense too. And but I think there's a way to kind of match these things together. There is a book written by Clifford Williams, a Christian philosopher, called Existential Reasons for Believing God. And Clifford Williams tries to put forward a pragmatic case for believing in God based on existential reasons, but later on in the book he tries to combine it with an evidential case, and there are different ways that he does that. But his basic existentialist argument is something like that I need the sense of having cosmic meaning, or I need the sense of feeling that I am loved or I'm protected. I need these things existentially. Belief in God satisfies these needs. Therefore, I'm justified in believing in God at a pragmatic level.
Yeah.
But then he tries to combine that, as I said, evidentially, and there are different ways that he does it. And one of the ways he does it is in a kind of reformed epistemological or Plantingian way. And he basically says that, well, look, we have these needs, like a need for meaning, a need to be loved, a need to be protected. But maybe these needs are something that God has kind of put within us, that act as kind of triggers for belief in him. And if we have a kind of faculty that he instilled within us, and that's working properly, we'd actually have good epistemic grounds as well as our existential grounds at the same time. So I think I quite like that approach.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Let's go anti-clockwise. And now we have Mushfiq Sultan Sahab to ask his question.
Yes, thank you, Danish, and thank you, Jamie, for a wonderful presentation.
Please speak up. Please speak up, Mushfiq Sahab. We can't hear you.
My voice is not clear. Oh, sorry. I dropped something. Is my voice clear now?
It's getting clear. Yeah, it's good.
Yeah, I had forgotten to we were immersed in rationality and philosophy, so this happens. So my question, Jamie, is like in Ibn Taymiyyah's works, does he define what fitrah is? Like what constitutes fitrah? How do we know it? And how is fitrah distinct from pure reason, as he puts it?
Mm-hmm. Okay, yeah, good question.
How does he substantiate his claim? I mean, if he bases his entire position on fitrah, does he consider it to be self-evident, or does he adduce some arguments in favor of that?
Good question. So the concept of fitrah, as you know, is derived from Islamic sources. So it's not something that Ibn Taymiyyah is just coming up with. It's something that he takes out of the Islamic sources. And when it comes to him defining fitrah, there is a place where I quote in an article from his Majmu' al-Fatawa, where he's very explicit in defining it. There are different places where he explicates what fitrah might mean and the implication of it, but in that place, he basically says that he quotes the hadith of the Prophet that every child's born on fitrah, and he basically says that this is the natural inclination to Islam, and then he defines Islam by simply La ilaha illallah, that there is no God worthy of worship except Allah. But, that's not the only place where he offers a kind of explication as to what it means, because he will talk about the fact that we can know by fitrah that two is half of one, one is half of two, for example. So the various different things that he says about it. But from what I understand, Ibn Taymiyyah seems to be saying that fitrah is, and this is a term I take from Kal Sharif at-Tabghi's recent book, Ibn Taymiyyah on Reason and Revelation, which he defines it as the original normative disposition. So human beings have been created on this original normative disposition. And that disposition is original in the sense that it is this kind of primordial constitution that God has created every human being upon. And it's normative in the sense that it inclines us to believe in certain things, that if this original primordial constitution is intact, it will push us to believe that in certain moral truths and religious truths. What's his reason for thinking that there is such a thing as a fitrah? Well, the Quran and the Sunnah, essentially. But can we step us out of that and try to think of our own philosophical arguments or grounds for thinking there is such a thing as a fitrah? Yeah, I think we can. In fact, it's interesting, Danish, you sent me the video of Ghamidi talking about fitrah, which I listened to part of, and I happen to agree with everything that he said, and for the first 5 minutes anyway. I didn't listen to the whole thing, but the first 5 minutes he was basically just defining what he understands fitrah to be, and he was saying, look, that human beings, we have a basic human nature, right? We can all agree with that. How do we recognize one another right now as human beings? The only way we can do that is if we have a shared nature which we all participate in. And the same thing with a cup or a book or a car or whatever the case may be. In fact, Ghamidi gives the example of a car, and elsewhere I've given that example too. So it's just a coincidence we both made the same example. A car has a particular nature or makeup. A car has certain parts, a steering wheel, it has tires, it has wheels, it has a bonnet, whatever. And those different parts, when you put them together, make up the nature of the car. We human beings, we have a basic nature. We have a certain biological nature. We have certain organs that we share. We have a brain. And we have certain cognitive faculties. We have sense perception. We have reason. We have memory. We have introspection. And so I think these aspects of us, which we all share in, which make us human beings, that is our fitrah. So we can know that we have a human nature or a fitrah just by looking around at one another and conversing and doing scientific inquiry. We all seem to have, at least, for most people, we all seem to have the ability to remember, to perceive, the ability to think, and so on. So that's what I take fitrah to be. And so that's why it would be a fitri belief to know that one is half of two, because that's just a natural product of reason, which we all seem to participate in. It's a fitri belief that this laptop is in front of me because it's a natural product of my sensory faculties when they're working well. It's a fitri belief that I had whatever I had yesterday for breakfast. Now, if we've been endowed with a faculty for knowing God, the idea is that, my view in epistemology is that so long as our faculties are working properly in the right environment, we can know stuff. Like I can know that my laptop's in front of me, my phone's here, there's a cup there, there's a pencil there, whatever. As long as my sensory faculties are working well. So if God exists and Islam is true, it seems that Allah has endowed us with the faculty to know Him, according to Ibn Taymiyyah. And so as long as that faculty is working well, just like our other faculties, then we can know God. Notice that I cannot, in a non-question begging or circular way, prove to you that my faculties are functioning properly, or that they are truth-aimed. I can't do that without using them. For instance, if I want to check whether my faculties are reliable or not, I can't check without relying on them. I can't prove to you that I wasn't created 5 minutes ago with implanted memories of things which never happened. So I have to rely on my basic faculties and makeup. So likewise, with the fitrah, it doesn't seem necessary that we have to prove that there is a fitrah. Rather, we would say that if there is such a thing and it's working properly, then we can know God. Likewise, if my sensory faculties are working properly and aimed at truth, then we can know. Can I prove to you that they are functioning properly in a non-question begging way? No. Can I prove that they're aimed at truth in a non-question begging way? No. So we have to rely on them.
Mushfiq Saab, do you have another question?
Is the program, I think, working fine, the session, or did some...
It's working fine.
Sorry, Mukarram. Yeah, Mukarram disappeared, but that's okay.
All right.
Oh, no, that's not okay. We need Mukarram back for his question.
In your article, or the chapter as well, you've written that about Ibn Taymiyyah's view of fitrah, and you've written, I guess, these are your words, please correct me if I'm wrong. You've written, it would not be quite right to think of fitrah as a distinct cognitive faculty per se. Rather, it is the focal point around which all other faculties turn for direction. So what would that mean? It's not a faculty, but it is a point around which all other faculties turn for direction.
Yeah, no, that's a good question. And I also remember you asked me the question about the difference between fitrah and pure reason, and I forgot. Yeah, so aql is a faculty. Our hawas, our different sensory faculties, they are faculties clearly. Memory is a faculty, maybe introspection is a faculty and stuff. So we seem to have these faculties. Fitrah isn't a faculty. If we're saying that human beings have been created upon fitrah, فطرة الله التي فطر الناس عليها, that Allah created us upon fitrah. Did He create us on a faculty? No. God created us on this natural disposition and constitution. So it doesn't seem to be the case that fitrah is a faculty, and Ibn Taymiyyah doesn't seem to be saying that. when he says that we can know certain things, fitri daruri is the word he uses, that we can know things in a kind of natural and a necessary way. He says that with respect to lots of different things where we'd be using different faculties. So that's what I'd say initially. But then if God has created us upon a certain constitution, he's endowed us with certain faculties that are kind of inbuilt into this constitution, then that very human nature or constitution is supposed to be kind of guiding our faculties, if you like. If God has set us up in such a way as human beings to know him and to know things around us, then God has obviously set up our faculties to do that. And those faculties are grounded in our human nature. So when our human nature is intact, then those faculties will function accordingly, and be able to give us knowledge. So that's what I would say.
Excellent, excellent.
Thank you.
Mushfiq Saab, do you have any other question?
No, not.
Okay,
any
so
other-
until Mukarram joins us again, I'd like to ask a question again, Jamie, if that's okay.
Yeah, absolutely.
So you said something about the traditionalists, Ibn Qudama and especially Ibn Taymiyyah,
Yeah.
basically challenging the mutakallimun about concretizing reason in some sense. They thought that pure reason was something different from the Hellenized rationality that they smuggled into the Islamic tradition. And so do you want to say that there is something called pure reason which the Quran itself defines as such, or can we find such a definition of reason in the Quran?
A definition of pure reason in the Quran, I personally don't know, the answer to that question. What I meant by distinguishing concrete reason from pure reason was, well, this is not a phrase that I've coined. This is taken from another philosopher called C. Stephen Evans, but it's also borrowed from, not those terms, but the idea from Sherman Jackson, again, when he was talking about Islamic traditionalism. And yeah, basically the idea is that different, I mean, and this is also a view of Alistair McIntyre, that like different periods in human history and different communities within human civilization seem to have differed on what's reasonable and rational. What might be considered to be reasonable and rational for somebody living in the 21st century in the broadly Western secular world would be maybe different from rationality and reason in the Middle Ages. So the idea is that the Islamic traditionalists seem to be, for example, look, Ibn Taymiyyah, he wrote the book Al-Rad al-Mantiqiyin, the rebuttal of the logicians.
Yeah.
But that's not really what it means. It's not a rebuttal of mantiq or logic or the logicians. It's aptly translated by Wael Halak as the rebuttal of the Greek logicians, number one. And really, it's not even that. It's the rebuttal of Ibn Sina, basically, because Ibn Taymiyyah's source for quote-unquote Greek logic was Ibn Sina and Ibn Rushd, and I suppose, and a few others. So it seems to be the case that what Ibn Taymiyyah and some traditionalists are saying is, well, what you guys take to be rational, i.e. Aristotelian logic and Neoplatonic thinking, that is not really rationality in the clear and pure sense. Rather, it's a contamination or a divergence from the rationality which the Quran is coming with. God created us with a rational faculty, and the Quran is in congruence with that faculty. So if you if your Hellenistic rationality is telling you that there is something to be concerned about in Revelation, well, the concern is probably with the Hellenistic rationality and not with the Quran. And so there is a difference, as I said, between like concrete reason that's concrete in a particular time and place, and pure reason which stands outside of that, aql sarih, in Ibn Taymiyyah's terminology.
Excellent. What would you say is Ibn Taymiyyah's view of reason as such? I mean, what's the analog in the Western tradition, or how can we understand it to get a reference for it in our contemporary times? I know that's not a fair question, but I still want to know.
Well, Ibn Taymiyyah basically defined reason as an ability to do a couple of things. Basically, he said that it's an ability to abstract from observing particulars. So reason allows us to basically abstract from observing particular things and coming up with universal concept. So when I observe lots of particular chairs, I come up with the concept, the universal of chairness or chair. And reason allows us to do that process of abstraction. And reason also allows us to infer from something. If I see footprints in the sand, I can infer that there was probably somebody who walked by. If I see there's smoke, then I can infer that there's fire. If I, find Danish's fingerprints on the murder weapon, I might infer that Danish, committed the crime. So reason is this ability to abstract from particulars to universals and to infer from one belief to another. And that seems to be like something that even today we can, happily go along with. It's a fair account of reason, I think. Yeah.
Excellent. I think Raza Bhai, if you have a question, now is the time.
All right. No, I, a lot of things were somewhat familiar. So the presentation was quite interesting, from more of a content point of view, because I did not have that detailed introduction and which people fell in which camps, for example. In one of the slides, you were showing maybe 3 books, and you were saying one of them argued from a Bayesian point of view and took more of a statistical position on why we should believe that there is a God. I was just wondering on the statistical question, right? If we just take things individually and then try and reason from there, now we are talking about how can we argue about God. If we take things individually and try and kind of establish this question based on that, then we might fail as we generally do, and nothing really stands up that strongly, right? But if you look at it more from a statistical point of view, and if you bring a bunch of things together, right, and you look at the possibility of many things pointing in some direction and reinforcing an idea, right, then we might argue from a statistical point of view that there is stronger evidence to suggest that something might be the case. Right. And has anybody tried to argue from that point of view, or try to make that argument that no, don't look at one statistical value and try and assess based on that, or just look at them individually, rather look at them in a collective manner and see how all of them jointly imply something?
Yeah, well, thanks for the question, and you put it very well. The book in question does exactly that. And so basically Richard Swinburne's Bayesian case for God's existence, for believing in God, is a kind of a cumulative case. So he looks at various different features of the world, the fact that the world is exhibits like natural order, the fact that there are moral, conscious creatures and agents, the fact that the world exhibits beauty, the fact that it seems to be finely tuned, the fact that there are contingent things, the fact that the universe had a beginning, we might say. And then, on the basis of looking at each of these individual data points, then that supports the hypothesis of theism as being more probable than not. Basically, what Swinburne does is he coins a difference between what he calls a C inductive argument and a P inductive argument. For a C inductive argument, he basically says that a good C inductive argument is where a given piece of data just raises the probability of a hypothesis. And then what he does is he says, well, there are lots of different C inductive arguments, and together they create a P inductive argument, which is that a good P inductive argument is where the data shows that the probability of the hypothesis is more likely than not. And that's his approach. He's not the first to have come up with a cumulative case. He was obviously at Oxford University. He's a professor emeritus at Oxford. And the person who held his post before him, Basil Mitchell, he also came up with this cumulative case approach. And it's something that philosophers of religion often engage in trying to do. And as you have suggested, it does make more sense, I think, to take that approach, and rather than necessarily, fixating on just one data point. And I certainly would, if I wanted to offer a natural theological case, I think I would do something like that. But of course, the epistemic question that we've been entertaining here is, well, is that necessary to know God or to be justified? For instance, some aspects of the Islamic tradition might say yes, not necessarily a Bayesian case, but an argumentative case. Others seem to say no. Even if they don't say it's necessary, I think they could all agree it's sufficient anyway. If you have such a strong case, it would be sufficient.
Yeah. I mean, I could link it to the case of, Danish Bhai committing a murder, right? I mean, even if we found his fingerprints on the murder weapon, the question is, if we just go by the single data point, we might conclude that he is the murderer. I mean, but when I look at him, I don't see a murderer, right? So that is one data point. Probabilistic speaking, that is saying that he may not be the case. Then I look at all his, boring conversations that I've had with them. That is not a murderer. They are more exciting people, right?
I agree.
They are more swayed by emotions. So he's not that guy. Then we might look at his other areas of life. So probabilistically speaking, and looking at what he might be capable of in different areas, we might be able to arrive at the conclusions that it is possible this data point is not an accurate data point. Maybe there was a mistake here. Maybe he did not commit this. So let's question this data point further.
Yeah, 100%. Yeah, I was actually thinking the same thing, that it was in my mind that, I'm saying that we can infer from that, from the fingerprints to the fact that he did it. But I was thinking in my head, well, although you can make that inference, I'm not sure whether it's a justified inference, because, you need more evidence than that. Even my own personal, interaction with Danish don't suggest that he's capable of that. So if my background knowledge suggests that if I happen to find out that his fingerprints were on it, then I'd probably question.
Maybe it got there accidentally. Maybe somebody planted it.
Framed. Yeah, I think.
So all of those are possibilities. So we might have to consider it based on other probabilities.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I agree.
Or I might be playing a really long game.
You don't have it in you. Yeah. So over to you, Danish Bhai. So if you want to continue it.
Yeah. So I have Mukarram's question, which I now understood.
1 second. I need to turn my light on. 1 second.
Okay.
So we had a bit of fun at Danish Bhai's expense.
Always, anytime. Aapki khidmat mein hazir hu.
That tells us that you're not a murderer.
Yeah. No, there are emotionally disturbed murderers also who, let's say, have been pushovers all their lives. So now there's a moment in which they snap and then they commit murder. That's also there. Anyway, so Mukarram
Can I
is
be
back.
heard? Yeah, I'm so
Yeah,
sorry,
yeah.
but the
You
connection
came
is a
at the
bit
right
bad today.
time. No problem.
Yes.
Don't worry. Yeah.
And thank you, Al-Mawrid, for this opportunity, and thank you, Professor Turner, for the presentation. I just had two questions. The first one was, could you please talk a bit more about the idea of or the concept of epistemology? My own higher education has introduced me to this term as something which concerns more with which is discussed more in the context of knowledge formation, the construction of knowledge, and so on and so forth. To my mind, the Islamic perspective, rather than approaching knowledge from the point of view of the formation of knowledge or the construction of knowledge, seems to approach it more axiomatically. What I mean to say is that it bases its understanding of knowledge as emanating from the Shahada quite clearly, and it bases itself on that axiom that all knowledge proceeds from the Shahada. And to my mind, that appears a bit different from understanding from the understanding of epistemology that I've just shared. And my second question is could you also discuss more about how is there different ways in which Aql has been understood in the Islamic tradition? I thought that the presentation, it took it to mean reason, which is how it is used today. But one has heard discussions where Aql has been said to have meant in the past something more than mere reason, perhaps to indicate that even the heart could be the seat of the Aql, rather than it implying to be mere reason as we understand it today. So these were the two questions: epistemology and Aql.
Yeah, thanks very much, Mukarram. So to address the first one, I think you would be right in saying that to have this kind of conceptually rich knowledge of God and Islam prior to the Shahada, prior to actually accepting the Quran as a source of knowledge and the Prophet's teachings as a source of knowledge, we would be lacking a great deal of knowledge about who God is, his intention and plans for human beings, the fact that there are messengers that have been sent, and so on. So I think in order for us to have rich theistic knowledge, evidently revelation is going to be necessary. And prior to it, the knowledge that we have of a theistic nature will be quite thin as opposed to thick, if you get me. Now, to say, for example, that our knowledge of God begins with the Shahada, begins with accepting God's existence, well, obviously it presupposes the truth of Islam, first and foremost. So suppose somebody is not yet a Muslim, we might ask, how are they going to come to the belief that God exists and that Islam is true? It seems to me that that person is going to need some reason or evidence that will bring them to that position, that will bring them to the point of accepting the Shahada. I mean, I'm kind of talking from experience in my case, but you can imagine that to be the case with anybody who's not already a Muslim. So it seems to me that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala obviously has made possible ways to know him. even for those people who are not born in the Muslim community. It seems to me that from a Quranic point of view, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created all of humanity to worship him and to know him. And God made that possible for all human beings. So how is that possibility of knowledge achieved for somebody who's not already in the Muslim tradition? It seems to me that they're going to have some evidence, some reason, some basis that brings them to the Shahada. Now, the question could be, well, okay, maybe there are some experiences and some reasons that bring them to the Shahada, but maybe not until the Shahada do they know Allah. But I would say that if the reasons and the evidences are good enough, from an epistemic point of view, I don't see why they wouldn't actually know God anyway, even before taking the Shahada. For instance, if somebody has good arguments or good evidence for thinking that Allah exists in a kind of broad sense by the term Allah, then I don't see why they wouldn't actually possess knowledge at that time. The other thing to say from a Taymiyan point of view is that he seems to be saying that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created us upon fitrah, such that if our fitrah is intact, then we can reach knowledge of God. Now, can that fitrah be intact without being in a revealed community, without being in a community of revelation? I get the impression that Ibn Taymiyyah thinks that at least as long as somebody's not contaminated by social pressure in some way, then a person will come to believe in God. But I could agree with you to some extent, because although I think that a person might be able to know God independent of revelation and before the Shahada, let's say, I don't think that conception of God would be a thick concept. It wouldn't be a concept of Allah with Asma al-Husna with 99 names. We don't know those things until we accept Islam and so on. So probably, in fact, Ibn Taymiyyah, for instance, talks about that we can know through the ayat in the creation and through fitrah that there exists a khaliq or sani', like a maker or a creator, but not necessarily Allah in the fullest sense. So maybe to know Allah in the fullest sense, we need to accept revelation. But it would still raise a question for me, as someone who's interested in the epistemic questions, is on what am I justified in thinking that the Quran is from God? What's my justification for thinking the Quran is from God? How do I know that the Quran is from God? How can I be rational in believing the Quran is from God? And again, those questions will push us into the debate that I've been going into in this presentation. Maybe it's based on fitrah. Maybe it's based on argument or evidence. Maybe it's based on evidence in the community, but not for an individual, or whatever the case may be. Maybe it's based on testimony. Maybe we can know by testimony that the Quran is a true revelation from God, and we follow the testimonial tradition. So by simply saying that knowledge of Allah doesn't begin until Shahada, it's like, yeah, in a sense, I agree with you, but clearly that presupposes the truth of Islam, and we would want to ask the question as to how can I actually know Islam is true? By simply saying, you know Islam is true once you accept the Shahada, again, begs the question, it seems to me, because you're assuming that the Shahada is something concerning what's actually true. I want to ask again, how do I know that that's actually true, and so on. But as I said, I would agree with you if you mean that Allah in the fullest sense of all his richness and his nature and the things that he's intended for us, we need to accept Islam before we're going to get that kind of knowledge. The other thing is that, yeah, you're right in saying that there are different ways in which Muslim philosophers and theologians have understood the term aql. Unfortunately, when you kind of fell off the stream, I was giving Ibn Taymiyyah's account, which is not his own account, by the way. It's also an account that other Muslim theologians and mutakallimun give, which is that the aql basically is an ability to abstract from observing particulars in the world, to abstract a universal concept, a universal, and to infer from certain data in the world to a conclusion, inferring from premises to a conclusion, let's say. Now, what you said about, the nature of aql and whether it's properly rendered reason or something is a valid question. I know that Sayyid Hussein Nasr, for example, really doesn't like the term reason, and he says that we should be using the term intellect, and he will only use the term intellect. I am not too bogged down in that, and it doesn't really bother me too much. I think that the translation, okay, if you don't like it, then fine, I'm happy with intellect or reason. Reason for me does a job. But then you're concerned about what's the relationship between reason and the heart, or between aql and the heart. I think that's a good point. The traditionalist view, like the Taymiyyan traditionalist view, seems to suggest that we probably can't access the evidence for God unless we have the right kind of spiritual character or disposition. If we are rebellious against God, if we're sinful and the like, we know even from a Quranic context, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in a particular verse in the Quran, I can't remember the full verse, but Allah says that He will turn people away from His signs, those who walk upon the earth in arrogance. And we also know this idea of a khatam on the heart, this sort of covering and veil that might take place. Now, I think in those contexts, somebody who has that veil and covering and turning away from Allah's signs, clearly they will not be able to access the kind of evidence for God's existence that somebody who is spiritually pure would. And so I think that there might be a relation in that sense between reason or intellect in the heart. For example, if the Quran is telling us to do tafakkur and tadabbur of the ayat in nature, how am I able to, and if it's the case that I'm only able to access the evidence of God if my heart is not covered and veiled and the like, then it seems there is a relationship between that tafakkur, where I'm doing a reflection over God's signs, and the heart being pure. The Quran also does use the heart in the context of saying that, referring to the disbelievers who have qulubun la yafqahun, hearts with which they do not understand. And so that seems to be a Quranic idea as well. So, yeah.
Thank you so much. Yes.
No
I think of, yeah.
Excellent. So I could use moderator's privilege to ask another question, but I think I can hear the Maghrib Azan where you are, Jamie. So so I think we've had a very enlightening session, and I don't use the word enlightening as a cliche. It was quite something. It was interesting, and very, very grateful for you to have shared your time so generously, and for the other panelists, even though we had some technical difficulties. But Mukarram came in just in time to ask his question, and we had
my apologies once again for the technical.
No problem at all. So I think with a little bit of editing, this session is going to be published very soon. And I want to thank Razabai for handling the session behind the scenes, and our panelists for joining us so late in time. It's beyond Isha here. I mean, it's close to 11, I think. And thank you, Jamie, for finally coming on to the Al-Mawrid Canada YouTube channel. And we would want to have you again, inshallah, if you have time in the future. And Another news for our viewers is that Jamie has recently given a mammoth 3.5-hour session with Blogging Theology, the foremost YouTube channel for Muslims anywhere in the world right now, on intellectual topics galore. And please do check that out as well. If that comes out before our video is published, we're going to put that in the description. We're also trying to put Jamie's own page under the description. I think Razabhai can help us with that. So thank you again, Jamie. Thank you, Mushfiq. Thank you, Mukarram.
Thank you very much.
Razabhai.
Thank you.
Excellent.
Thank you so much.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Wa alaikum salam.
Okay, great.